This week is all about incorporating source material into your argument. So remember, a research paper is not just a collection of direct quotations and paraphrased ideas sort of cobbled together. This is your argument, your paper. As it says in chapter 19 that you were looking at last week, you're going to offer a thesis and you're going to support your argument with research and outside sources that demonstrate that what you're saying has merit and has support. So that's why we started with fewer sources, so you could get more to what your ideas were. And now we're bringing in more research so that this remains your argument without being overwhelmed by sources, and yet incorporates these to make that argument stronger. So steps for doing this are not just finding texts that say what you want them to say and plopping them in there. There's actually an art to a research paper, and learning this here is what you're going to need for the rest of your graduate careers in college, because writing reports, supporting reports is what academic writing is all about. So first, get your sources and make sure they're incorporated in a clear and logical way, and that you're choosing the best source and the best material from those sources. So if you go back to some of the comments I made on your papers, sometimes I'd say, hey, this is a great quote. Could you expand on it further? Or, hey, this is a great quote you have here, but the relationship between this quote and the text isn't quite clear to the reader. Consider finding a new quote. Because although the argument may be there, sometimes it's hard to pick out exactly what material we want to support the point that we're trying to make. And on that note, don't overuse quotations or even paraphrasing. It's better to paraphrase or summarize than to quote. Quotes can feel like sort of verbal whiplash. You're going along and you're reading this in one person's voice, and then suddenly you're switching out of it. So make sure you do that sparingly, and do it when the language in that quote is really important and something that you're going to analyze. So for example, here it shows a bad use of a quote. As one movie critic wrote, "The film is really terrible, people should ignore it." Well, that phrase would be better just summarized or paraphrased and cited in the author's voice, and then cited with the source of that material. Now, a quote though like this, which really sort of emphasizes how put out the critic was and the way this film just sort of grated on them, that might build an argument because there's emotional language in it, and so you could consider using it. As one movie critic wrote, "The film is," and I quote, "clearly intended for people who move their lips not only when they read, but also when they watch TV." That's powerful, and the language is descriptive, and you can follow that up with an analysis of the language or of what that critic is saying. Why is this film something that was meant for people who sort of read along with a film? So, following that, that's when to choose a quote. Now, how do we set this up? This is a dropped-in phrase. That is, someone just plopped in a citation, and it doesn't really work. So scientists have been studying the ill effects of nitrates on test animals since 1961. Drops a quote. And then Smith. This is correctly cited. We have the author's last name. We have the page number. It's in parentheses. We have the correct quotations. We have the correct end punctuation here. All of this is correct MLA citation. But this is not a good use of quotes. This is much better. Scientists have been studying the ill effect of nitrates on test animals since 1961. According to Dr. William Smith, head of the Farrell Institute of Research, who conducted the largest experiment thus far, and then it gives nitrates produce malignant tumors in 62% of test animals within 6 months. And this is also a correct MLA citation, because up here in the tag, We have who the author is, so we don't need to list that author again. So that's a correct MLA citation. And this is a much better, though, use of quotations because one, it not only says who's going to say it, but it explains why we should care about this person's expertise and this particular study. This is the largest experiment thus far. The size of a study matters, right? It matters for the efficacy of the test results. And so getting material from the largest study that's been done and been done by a very credible institution and supposedly something that's very closely related to what the paper topic is, that lets your reader understand why they should care about what's being said. Okay, that seems really credible. And then they keep going and they feel, yeah, this person's really done their homework and they've been looking at the good studies to try to come up with what matters. Here, read over from chapter 19. Again, this is a great sort of variation in different ways to introduce material. Don't just say something Wilma Smith said, John Jones said, Mary Brown said. That's bland. And it gets very boring very quickly. For you, for your reader, think about these sorts of different ways you can incorporate in evidence, doing it in varied and interesting manner. So, punctuation. Look back at your drafts. On a lot of them, I put comments about correct punctuation. Correct punctuation for a quote is if the quote is one sentence or less, we have the double quotations, then we have the parenthetical citation, that is either the number or the page number or the page number and the name, as we have up here with Smith 109. And then you have your end punctuation, that period. So that's about how long your quote should be. You should really, really avoid block quotes. Because remember, this is your argument. This is not, we want to know what someone else said. We want to know that there's evidence to support what you're saying. Finally, because you all are going back and revising a paper you've already written, this is a great opportunity to make certain that you've supported your assertions or claims and that support isn't still in the source or in your head. Because believe it or not, this happens to so many of us, particularly me. I'll find what I write down and what I'm thinking are not exactly the same. And so a lot of times I've got the argument here, but the words that have come out sort of talk around the argument without really making a point. So that's why not only are you doing these drafts, but we're going to talk in conferences, because when you talk out some of these points with someone, they get stronger and stronger. So everything that we were talking about up there, things like when you're choosing how to use a quote, think about things like identifying the exact study, making sure that the figures relate directly to what you're saying, and figuring out how reliable and why this source is the most reliable. You might be able to find a bunch of sources that support your claims, but what you want is not a bunch. You want the best ones, the ones that'll be most convincing for your audience. And then all of this comes back to, this is about you. This is about your argument, and the sources should be either supporting you or should be counter arguments that you're taking apart and proving that your argument is an argument that needs to be made because there's still sources out there that are thinking differently. So all of this is ways to be incorporating source material. Think about this as you are making your revisions, and we're going to be moving on to how to do an outline or a re-outline of your paper.